Great. Well, to begin, this is dangerous and disgusting tourism. We're going to start with the disgusting portion of it. But, oh, that's my, no, where's my actual first page? There it is. All right. So, Chicago lies right in the midpoint between the East and the West. It's offering the best and the worst of both sides in equal measure in the same place. The class of the East, the wild of the West, the work of the West, the ingenuity of the East. And Chicago of the turn of the century, especially in its tourism guides, asked, what if you could stay at the Waldorf Astoria and drop into Deadwood whenever you wanted to? Yeah? The first of that is the stockyards. Believe it or not, everybody was told to go visit the stockyards when they visited Chicago. Great Union Stockyards, this massive, huge area. This is an aerial view from 1938, spanning between Halstead and Pershing and down to, I think that's 45th down there. This massive city of meat. Why would anyone want to go see that? Yeah? Was one man wrote, Julian Street, he was a Chicagoan turned New Yorker in 1914. He wrote, a friend of his was complaining, why is it that everyone who comes out here has to go to the stockyards? Street considered not going, but after his visit to Chicago was announced in the papers, he wrote, quote, presently the stockyards began to call us up. It didn't even ask if we were coming, it just asked when. As Armour's son, Armour, one of the three big meatpacking plants, his son Lester wrote in 1933 as part of a promotion for the World's Fair, quote, the further away a man lives, the more likely he is to insist on including packing town in his itinerary. I'm going to be giving you a lot of quotes from these guides, and the important thing with this as well as the caveat is I'm not going to give you a ton of facts about all this. I'm more interested in what people are told about these things and what people write about it afterwards. What are the opinions of people? Rand McNally, for example, in 1907, in their guide to Chicago, wrote, cosmopolitan indeed is the sightseeing throng that surges through the entrances of Chicago stockyards. Ruddy-faced Germans jostle globe-trotting Englishmen, and the Japanese tourist, invariably armed with a camera, is a familiar figure. I thought that was a later stereotype invention. Every state in the Union, as well as almost every country in the globe, contributes its quota to the tide of humanity that ebbs and flows here with unflailing regularity. For the world-famed live stockyard market enjoys unique distinction. They were one of one, the stockyards. As Rand McNally said, there are other waterfalls than Niagara. Mountains innumerable rear their crags amid the clouds, but the Chicago stockyards is incomparable. Wherever civilization has reached, Chicago food products are standard, and that interest should be manifested in the source of supply is inevitable. Chicago has other sites to which feasts the stranger with her gates, but from among them, the stockyards and its allied industries, the packing houses, stand out among them as the chief center of interest. As an exposition of modern mechanical ingenuity, nothing more can be desired. In this sphere, the superlative degree of achievement is everywhere in evidence. You want to see the greatest of anything? You come to the stockyards to do it. The French novelist Paul Bourget, who visited in 1894, wrote, the technical details are very difficult to grasp. They are less so here because the directors of these colossal manufactories of roast beef and hams had discovered that the best possible advertising is to admit the public to witness their process of working. These abattoirs furnish material most precious to the foreigner who desires to understand the spirit in which Americans undertake their great enterprises. A slaughterhouse capable of shipping in 12 months to the four parts of the immense continent 3,500,000 dressed cattle is worth every trouble of investigating. This meat went everywhere, and you could come to the place where it was made. It went to the west, it went back to the west, it went to the east, it went to Europe. One of the big draws was the scale of everything. You can see here the cattle pens on this side, and then the packing houses there. The cattle would come in these huge droves. And right in the middle of this massive city was a ranch, basically. And for small farmers coming to this place, it was like nothing they'd ever seen before, people coming from rural communities. For example, this postcard I have, written by a man named Wilmer Bridley. In 1907, he was from rural Pennsylvania, and he wrote a postcard after his visit to his brother Wilma, a dairy farmer in rural Columbus, Pennsylvania. He wrote, quote, I spent the day around the yards and in Armour and Swift's packing house, saw cattle enough to cover your farm all over. Very, very true. I tried looking up how many cattle are on a dairy farm normally. The stats aren't out there and easy to find. And the numbers, every single guide, every single publication, every single thing writing goes so deep into the numbers, it's hard to know what is real and what is not. 265 million animals a year, 305 million cows, 7.7 million hogs, 2 million sheep, 7 million pounds of glue created, 10,000 tons of fertilizer, 7 miles of train cars coming and going, 8,000 cords of hickory, and 100,000 tons of salt, just to name some of them from many different sources. The scale of everything was impossible to understand, and that's what drew people. But to get there first, you'd have to travel there. And as you go there by train or by streetcar, the first thing you'd notice is the smell. As the 1893 Standard Guide wrote, quote, "From the packing houses comes an odor, a plainly perceptible odor, which is rather disagreeable at first." Upton Sinclair in The Jungle wrote, quote, "And along as his protagonist traveled down to Packingtown for the first time, along with a thickening smoke, they began to notice another circumstance, a strange, pungent odor. You could literally taste it, as well as smell it. You could take hold of it almost, and examine it at your leisure. It was an elemental odor, raw and crude. It was rich, almost rancid, sensual, and strong." The Standard Guide countered this, perhaps, earlier by saying, "The Packingtown odor has been unjustly criticized. It is unpleasant only on short acquaintance. To anyone accustomed to it here, there is only the pleasant suggestion of rich, ruddy blood and the long rows of tempting sides hung up to cool." In contrast to that, in a WTTW documentary, a resident of the area described it as smelling like one large toilet. The Standard Guide finally punches back by saying, "The stockyards atmosphere is healthful." Once you get into the stockyards, the first thing you're going to see is the West. You're going to see the Wild West and the cowboys. Newspaperman Justin Smith wrote in 1930, quote, "The pens are full of animals that yesterday or the day before enjoyed freedom on some plain or mountainside. This great checkerboard with squares of which there are swarms of cattle. Herds is not the word to use, for there are too many." Bourget wrote, quote, "There are narrow lanes between the fence with men on horseback riding up and down. These are the buyers, discussing prices with the cowboys of the West. You have heard of the ranches? Here you behold its heroes, in threadbare overcoats, slouch coats, and inevitable collar cuffs of the American." You take the train, the streetcar, out of Chicago and into the Wild West, where you can pick up a guide who's there to show you around the stockyards. Again, the firms wanted you to come. They wanted you to come to see the magnificence of this, to understand it, and more importantly, buy their products later down the line, because you could see how impressive and how healthful they wanted you to see it was. At times, apparently, you could just walk in and just let yourself into various doors and rooms and show yourself around, such as when Rudyard Kipling walked into just a bunch of piles, hanging pieces of meat going through and was nearly trampled by a steer. But for the most part, there were guides. These were the Swift Meatpacking Company's paid guides. It was 25 cents for a 75-minute tour. They ran every hour on the hour. Before it was professionalized, you would maybe just find a kid from Canaryville who would take some pocket change and just start showing you around and showing you things. But by the early 20th century, by around the turn of the century, things had become professionalized. This had become an industry, and the seeing of this industry had become an industry. So you go in, and the first thing you see is the pigs. Now, what happens to the pigs? The pigs are led in, chained to a wheel, raised up, their throats were cut, and then as they screamed and bled out, that wheel dropped them then into a boiling vat to remove their bristles. 800 pigs an hour were slaughtered as such. Kipling described it by saying, quote, "A red man with a knife, which he passes jauntily through their throats, and the full voice shriek became a sputter, and then as a fall as a heavy tropical rain. The red man, who was backed against the passage wall, stood clear of the wildly kicking hooves and passed his hand over his eyes, not from any feeling of compassion, but because the spurted blood was in his eyes, and he had barely time to stick the next arrival." In the jungle, as our protagonists took their first tour upon their arrival, they wrote, quote, "The uproar was appalling, perilous to the eardrums. One feared there was too much sound for the room to hold, that the walls must give way to the ceiling or the ceiling to crack. There were the high squeals and low squeals, grunts and wails of agony. There would come a momentary lull, and then a fresh outburst, louder than ever, surging up to deafening climax. Blood, sound, everything pouring, almost as if the place is going to break. You would not want someone to see this, much less a child, right? Nope. This illustration comes from the Swift Meatpacking Company's 1905 Guide to the Packing Yards. Here we have a lovely Gilded Age mother and father and their tiny child in a Swift hat sitting precariously on a probably poorly made wooden baluster as a pig is slaughtered mechanically behind her. We'll see her again. So after the pigs are killed and they're boiled to remove their bristles, what happens next is not hidden away. Again, it's shown. They're dressed, cut open, their parts removed. Here, a pig is having its face removed. The man inspecting it is not some random traveler. That is Lord Astor, an English nobleman on his visit to Chicago. Yeah? King Edward, the future King Edward VIII, was shown the same thing, but there was no picture taken of that. The pigs are moved into a room where, according to Swift, with only 6 strokes of the cleaver, it is divided into its parts. 20 minutes have elapsed since the pink-coated porker started on its journey in the room above. In about 2 hours, the meat is dry enough to be placed in the coolers to become properly chilled. They continued, visitors will be impressed by the skill and activity of the pork cutters. Each has his particular cut to make with the heavy cleaver, and so quickly and accurately is the work done that the side of pork seems to melt and vanish as it moves from block to block. In the 19th and early 20th century, this work was not so outside the realm of a lot of Americans and what they did. A lot of people were living on farms. A lot of people were going to butcher shops with, sides of meat hanging. A lot of people slaughtered and dressed their own animals. But when you did it on a farm, it took hours. It was a day-long affair with you and maybe a few helpers. Here, it was turned into an assembly line. And that, for those rural people, I'm going to commit to fully sitting on the chair now, what was so magnificent of it. As the Jungle wrote, quote, "It was all so very businesslike that one watched it fascinated. It was pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics." As Jorgis, the protagonist, went down the line with the rest of the visitors, staring open-mouthed, lost in wonder. He had dressed hogs himself in the forests of Lithuania, but he had never expected to live to see one hog dressed by several hundred men. It was like a wonderful poem to him. Put a different way by Kipling, they were so excessively alive, these pigs, and then they were so excessively dead. Then comes, and there's our child visiting the excessive death of everything. Then we come to the cows. All these cows in all these pens, as one man wrote, you couldn't even call them herds because it was too many. They're on the ground, but part of the magic of this process is the animals are sent up to the top and slowly move their way down. With a pig, it's light enough that they could get it onto that wheel and pick it up that way. Cows, they're too heavy. So what do? There is a Judas cow, a Texas steer who leads the cows up a ramp into the building. When they arrive there, he returns. Kipling saw him as an unwitting Judas, a poor, sad representation of what these places did to the humans who worked there as well. But the 1893 Standard Guide gave him agency. They wrote, quote, "He is perhaps the most depraved animal in existence. There is no element of brotherly love or patriotism in his nature. His duty at the yards is to guide droves of cattle to the slaughterhouses. He has mastered his little act and reduced steering steers to a science." Even the animals are scientific. Once they get there, I should have warned you at the beginning. There's going to be gross parts of this. I apologize. As Swift in their guide put it, from the runways, the cattle enter a small mechanically operated pens where they are painlessly dispatched by sledgehammer blow to the head. These images come from a Rand McNally guide to the stockyards. They wanted this published, the before and the after, here. Yes? And, of course, the children watch. She's given a thumbs up, it seems. It really looks like. It really looks like it is, yeah. I'll leave her up for this next quote from Kipling. Kipling wrote, quote, "If the pigmen were spattered in blood, the cow butchers were bathed in it. The blood ran in muttering gutters. There was no place for hand or foot that was not coated with the thickness of dried blood, and the stench of it in the nostrils bred fear." To which the Swift Guide wrote, "Visitors will note how perfectly ventilated the room, how bright the light by which the inspectors and dressers work." Don't really look it, yeah? Again, this is from the Rand McNally Guide. Novelist Paul Bourget wrote, quote, "The immense hall reeked with heavy moisture saturated with a strong, acrid odor, which seemed to seize you by the throat. Our feet were smeared in a sort of bloody mud." Kipling wrote, "There was a flavor of farmyard in my nostrils and the shouting of multitude in my ears, but there was no joy in that shouting. Each man carried a knife, the sleeves of shirt were cut off at the elbows, and from the bosom to heel he was blood red. The atmosphere was stifling as a night in the rains." Julian Street, the Chicagoan turned New Yorker, wrote that it was, quote, "a forest of dead meat." And you're seeing it all. Then comes the rest, everything else. Part of what made it so spectacular is that it wasn't just meat. It was paintbrushes, soap, fertilizer. Everything was used. One visitor, the Monsignor Count Peter de Vaya and Lustland, a Hungarian count and Catholic dignitary, he visited in 1905 at the insistence of an unnamed local orator and religious leader who said, "You gotta go." And he went, and he marveled in, quote, the hitherto unrivaled utilization of the residue. "Nothing is wasted" would be an appropriate motto to place over the packing houses. Nothing is wasted, neither material, nor labor, nor time. Labor, not wasted. And you'll notice who is doing the work making sausages in this images. It is the children. Children are doing work. And it's not apparently like it was some kind of secret, because there's a child in the Swift Guide working in the soap portion of the guide. A small child showing our other small child. It's two different children, one of them working there, one of them with her aristocratic parents visiting. And that was the reality of it. Nothing was wasted at all. But the other reality is that everything was wasted, yeah? The Swift Guide emphasizes the constant government checks and how everything is clean and ventilated, and every single time something moves, the glands are checked, they're stamped, everything is being inspected by the government. Everything was clean. But of course, as Sinclair Lewis showed in The Jungle, that was not really the case. Everything that the public was seeing was clean, but after hours, people were taking those diseased carcasses and, as Sinclair writes, canning them for local use only because interstate laws did not impact them. And part of what made this machine so fascinating to people was the speed of everything. That speed came because pacers were hired, men who were paid a little extra to go a little faster and push everybody else. And when they were burned out, they were scattered to the side and pushed a little further more. And there was this crush of constant people coming in to work and work and work, and they could just churn through them like so many pigs and so many cows. So what did people who visited take away from all of this? Well, in The Jungle, our protagonist Jurgis describes it as, quote, "a picture of human power, wonderful to watch. The manner in which they did this was something to be seen and never forgotten. They worked with furious intensity, literally upon the run at a pace with which there was nothing to be compared except a football game." And in that way, truly, it was like the gladiators. This was your way to see a gladiatorial match. Strong, young, vibrant men wielding knives, cutting things to bits, blood spurting everywhere, and you not having to engage too closely in it. And afterwards, you get a snack. Bourget wrote of his experience. The subdividing of this work, its precision, simplicity, quick succession succeeded in making us forget the necessary but intolerable brutality of the scenes which we had been witnessing. We all agreed that the first characteristic of this enterprise is the amplitude, or rather the stupendousness of its conception. It is a colossal effort of imagination. You can forget the horror of the reality because they start with the blood and they end with the product. Another writer, Collier, a novelist who visited Chicago, wrote, quote, "In Chicago you could have both pork and Plato, but pork, not Plato, has made Chicago. And Chicago people have not arrived at a stage of civilization yet where they can with proper propriety or advantage change their allegiance." Our Hungarian Monsignor, Devaya and Luskin, wrote, "It is true that these famous stockyards of Chicago, so often criticized and described, present one of the most sorrowful phases of modern industry. But they also show the successful substitution of machinery for manual labor and a hitherto unrivaled utilization of the residue. One thing only remained clear to me, namely, that a great deal of butchery is necessary to satisfy the needs of the Moloch of humanity." Street wrote, "The enthusiastic gentleman who escorted us kept pointing out the beauties of the way of this work was done, the cleanliness, the system by which the rooms are washed with steam, the gigantic scale of all the operations. I heard, I noticed, I agreed. But all the time, my mind was full of thoughts of dying pigs." As it was true for several, but most famously Kipling, who ended his visit by saying, quote, "By seeing a woman, elegant woman perhaps like the mother in our images we've seen, she stood in a patch of sunlight, the red blood under her shoes, the vivid carcasses tacked round her, a bullock bleeding its life away not 6 feet from her, and the death factory roaring around. She looked curiously, with hard, bold eyes, and was not ashamed. Then I said, 'Ah, this is a special sending. I have seen the city of Chicago.'" The city of Chicago is the stockyards, is the people who can go there and then go to the ballet that same evening. Our next spot of two is less squeamish. It's the levee, the red light district. Here we have a cartoon from, I believe this is from Chicago and its cesspools of infamy, is Dante peeking into Chicago's underworld and saying, "I wish I'd known about this before I wrote my poem." And because another place, besides the stockyards, that it would perhaps be a little surprising to know that tourist guides were recommending, or in this case maybe a little more trying to push people away from, was the levee, the red light district, the slum. Yeah? What was it? So in the 19th and early 20th century, in the 19th century, it was the area between Van Buren and Dearborn and Clark, going south, a little ways. It was a place of bars and of pawnbrokers and all these things of vice that had been pushed in there after the Little Chicago Fire of 1874 and sprung up in these little dingy houses. There was a subset called Cheyenne, which the Standard Guide claimed was because when it was developed, Cheyenne, Wyoming was the furthest town on the train that you could get to, and so they borrowed the name from it. But by 1893, the Standard Guide wrote, quote, "Today Cheyenne, Wyoming is a peaceable and prosperous little city, and its people have retaliated by dubbing the only disorderly part of their town Chicago." I was going to make a citation needed slide, but I forgot to do that. I, as far as I could tell, that didn't happen. How did it come to be that way? Well, in Chicago, we had the great Carter H. Harrisons, the first mayor in the 1870s, and then famously started his next term in 1893 and was assassinated. Then his son later on became mayor for 5 total terms. Carter Harrison Jr. later wrote in his memoirs that his father was a good old native Kentuckian who had also spent some time in Paris, and he believed in a bit of a wide open city, they call it, that you should let these things happen but know where they're happening and keep tabs on it. Important to note, though, that the Harrisons were from very wealthy, aristocratic Virginia stock and not Hicks. But the idea was, know where it's going on, keep an eye on it. The problem with that is it became so intertwined with the city and vice, and it became part, as you'll see, of this big machine. And a trip there was recommended. The Rand McNally Guide in 1893 wrote, quote, "It will be best to start from the southwest corner of Jackson and Clark Streets, near the main entrance of the Hotel Grace, keeping to the east side of the street. As you move southward, many cheap shops are passed. The gilded sign of the pawnbroker advertising bargains in unredeemed diamonds, watches, etc., is seen from almost any point of view, and you are now almost in the heart of the slums of Chicago. Tough-looking crowds are congregated before gaunt buildings, from whose fronts are suspended lurid signs announcing good beds for 10, 15, 25 cents. Restaurants from whose bills of fare a meal of bread, meat, potatoes, and coffee may be ordered for 8 and 10 cents are found in number. And at some of the barbershops located in basements, it costs only 3 cents to have a 2 weeks' growth of whiskers removed, and only 15 cents to be treated to both a shave and a haircut. It is certainly possible to hire a guide at some of our many private detective agencies, they recommended, and to pay him to show you the darker parts of town at midnight. But chances are, unless you are hunting for an opportunity to join in with some of the deviltry, which must hide away from the light and the law, that he will reveal little to you, if anything, more than you can see for yourself at night." Again, telling you what is there and then telling you, but maybe don't. But the fact that they're telling us it not to do it means there are people going there. And what kind of people? Tons and tons of people, because these guides were often, supposedly, taking them there. In 1912, Robert O'Harland wrote The Vice Bondage of a Great City, in which he wrote that several years ago, the agents of this system were bolder in their depravity. A guide that stood outside the Polk Street Depot waited for the gentleman of the long green and excited curiosity by the pronouncement, "Name a vice, a crime, a sin that was known from the beginning to the present day, and I will show it to you in Chicago today." And people went. Initially to that first levee, but then in 1905, Mayor Harrison shut down that near South levee, and they just moved south, even bigger and better than before. As writer Alston Smith wrote in 1953, "In no time at all, this new Tenderloin, far exceeding any other red light district in this city's history in any extent, was booming with a brazenness that made Little Cheyenne look like a churchyard." They took all the madams and the barkeeps, took the streetcar down from Van Buren to 22nd, and they set up a new shop, even bigger and larger than before. Alston Smith wrote that, quote, "After the dark, the district came alive. The red glass gleamed in the transoms, and the windows were thrown open if the weather was warm enough, and the strains of piano and orchestra music floated down the street. The air was gently troubled by the fumes of alcohol and perfume. On the north side of 22nd Street, dance orchestras banged away in Freiburgs and Bucksbums, and the continual stream of couples went back and forth between the palaces of Terpsichore," a word I have not been able to glean its definition. After midnight, the carriage trade began to come in, and the madams sent out beaters to flush the big spenders and entice them away from wherever they were to the madam's own superior establishment. Since those who had the big spenders took a dim view of attempts to lure them elsewhere, the presence of a wheel-heeled lush in the area always gave rise to numerous fights. There was something for every taste in the levee, from 25-cent cribs of Bedbug Row to the $200 facilities available at the Everly Club. So you are a wealthy lush. You've been tempted by a guide outside the Polk Street station, or someone has found you in your hotel lobby, invited you to come down and see a little bit of frivolity. Before you go, the Skies and Street Guide to Chicago from 1892 says, leave at home your silk hat, diamond studs, and kid gloves, and your watch too, if it's a valuable one. Don't exhibit a roll of bills when you pay for your occasional glass of beer or cigar. Don't be too inquisitive, and don't allow yourself into any backyards. Rand McNally warned, it will be best to make your appearance as unattractive as possible, entrusting your valuables with the clerk at your hotel. People went primarily for three different reasons. One is sort of familiar to you from our trip to the stockyards. It's the scale of it all, the massiveness. If you go to the stockyards to see the farming and cattle rearing of the West at an industrial scale, you come here to see the I'm trying to think. Did I write down the quote? I didn't write down the quote. The what Alston Smith called the back alley whoring of the East on an industrial scale. Yeah, this map famously is from a book by William T. Stead called "If Christ Came to Chicago," about his attempts to save the people of the levee and show what was there. As you can see, this 2-block stretch is full of brothels in red because they're the most concerning. Pawnbrokers, saloons, lodging houses, all packed in on just these 2 blocks, a tiny part of this much larger place.
Is that what's now Plymouth?
Custom House Place is Plymouth, yeah. Yeah, Custom House Place is Plymouth. This is now Printers Row. This is Printers Row now. You can go get a $15 latte. In the 1912 book, Vice Bondage of the Great City, Harland wrote, the scale again, "Chicago today is the most wicked city in the world. Babylon had its vices. So too Alexandria, Greece, and Rome struggled and died in a national moral degeneracy that they had created. Chicago has surpassed them all in wickedness. Nay, Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by the wrath of heaven, were pure when compared to Chicago. Paris and its lure of vice is tame by the side of Chicago. There is no parallel in history." You complain that much about how bad it is, somebody's going to want to go see it. In the numbers, again, Wilson, the writer of Chicago, Its Cesspools of Infamy, claimed, reminiscent of the accounts of the number of hogs and beef and salt, Chicago contains about 3,000 professional criminals. These consist of thieves, burglars, fences, and pickpockets. In addition to these, we may include the head of professional criminals, the following: women of ill fame, 20,000. Keepers of gambling houses and of policy and lottery offices, about 600, making in all about 23,600 professional lawbreakers. This is a startling statement, but unhappily true. As somebody who tries to make things intriguing in writing, I would close with 20,000 if I were to counsel Wilson to write that again. This is an image of the Harrison Police Station, this massive castle that was a clearinghouse for all of these people. The officers were in on it. They were being bribed weekly. There was a menu, supposedly, according to a Harper's Weekly writer, of how much you needed to pay based on what your business was to have them turn the other cheek. With the knowledge then, every now and then, you'd be raided, you'd pay out bond, you'd be back out on the street. This is an illustration of the lobby from that Harper's article. And Harper's wrote that, quote, "It is a dull evening when 50 arrests are not made, and is more likely to be 300. But the scale is not just about numbers. It is also about the impact of all this vice in one place. As Harland wrote, quote, "But look about you. There are more than 100 tables in this saloon. At each table sits at least one man and one woman. In every woman's face, if you're observant, is written a tragedy, either beginning that night or in its unfolding or finished years before. Do you see that washed-out bleach blonde with the colorless eyes who smiles at the drinking youth who sits beside her? She has lived through the tragedy. Life to her is but an aftermath of unending agony. The monster vice has long ago sucked the lifeblood from her veins. She has been discarded. She lives from day to day on her passing victims." The Chicago Inter-Ocean 1885 wrote that not even the imagination of Victor Hugo, pondering deeply and sympathetically upon the miseries of the more unfortunate, could reach to the depths of these levees around the world. Truth is not only stranger, but inconceivably more heartrending than fiction. The streets of Chicago bear perpetual testimony to the prevalence of the evil of which it is a part. The life which salacious fiction has represented as gay and joyous, if short-lived in its gaiety, is in reality one of prolonged torture. Which leads us to our second of three things that brought people to the levees to tour. Saving people, such as Stead in If Christ Came to Chicago. So many religious people and missionaries went there to try to save these children and stop the people from drinking, especially. 1893, the Women's Christian Temperance Union held their annual Congress in Chicago. Afterwards, a group of 7 women from Indiana decided they wanted to try the slums. And an age-old activity, slumming, was the term. As the Tribune wrote, quote, "The 7 Indiana women, all of them intensely interested in public charities and in the rescue of the fallen, had never visited the slums of a great city. A trip through the district inhabited by these people would give them a more correct idea of what they had heard and read. If what they had heard proved true, seeing the reality, they would be more forcible to impress their sisters with the necessity for more vigorous work among a class whose rescue had scarcely been attempted, save by the Sisters of the Salvation Army." They also brought with them 3 police officers and just barged in every door where they went, trying to see what it was. And they were not unique in that either. They supposedly also, on their first visit to the brothel, were told it was too full and they had to come back tomorrow. Throughout this article describing their visit, they also exclusively refer to the residents and people of the levee as inmates, which gives you a sense of what these people thought of them. These inmates were, quote, "from nearly every state in the Union and had generally left their homes in the country to seek work in Chicago." These religious protesters came in droves to try to save these people who had come from elsewhere, pouring into Chicago like the cattle to be slaughtered. They came from farms, they came from small towns, hoping for the best and being torn away in what came to be known as the white slave trade, which shows you the fervor, which kind of people were deemed worthy of the fervor. Harland wrote, quote, "It is wickedness, this wickedness is the outgrowth of the terrible irreligious system of commercialism that has reduced the sacred life of things to filthy gold and silver valuation. As long as men whose consciousnesses are stifled by gold dust, whose souls are godless, and whose hearts are dry and hard as a rock, control our ballot box, so long shall Chicago live under an infamous stigma." Because to fight the levee was to fight the power of this city as well. In Chicago's cesspools, Wilson wrote, "Thousands of girls from the country are entrapped each year, and the pitiful fact is that the parents of a large majority of these unfortunates are unaware of their fate." Harland wrote, these postcards were put out by the Midnight Mission, a group who every night was out there trying to fight against this perceived white slave trade. Harland wrote, quote, "Every year hundreds of young girls, undefiled and pure, drift into the wickedest city in the world and are carried away by the glare of the great white way and the sensuous lures of the dazzling cafes and the bohemian pleasures, and become unconsciously the recruits of the great absorbing vice trust." Because it's not enough just to come to Chicago and be captured, be stolen, abducted there. You could come to be an actor and be unknowingly to you pulled in. As a man from St. Paul, Minnesota, who has a theater degree, I feel this. As we pass from this cafe, the type of hundreds of others, note the attractive pictures on the wall, pictures of popular actors, prize fighters, and men of the world of sports. The girl who a year ago knew comparatively nothing of the world outside of her harmless, narrow sphere can now point to the pictures and give you the names with dangerous accuracy. They are now part of her bohemian world. She boasts familiarity with them. Olson Smith wrote that on the best corners, the Salvation Army set up its big brass drums and boomed hymns at the strumpets, imploring them to leave their lives of sin to come home. Since coming home meant leaving $25 to $100 a week in incomes for $5 to $6 a week jobs in shirt factories and department stores, not many of the fallen responded. Now, to Harlan's credit of talking Chicago, in writing in Chicago in the Great Vice Trust, I don't remember the title off the top, but you know, quote, this was a big issue to him as well. This wasn't just about saving, lily white girls from the city. It was also, in a small way, about making conditions elsewhere in the city better so they didn't require this. He wrote, quote, "The girl clerk in the department store tires of trying to live on her $6 a week salary, grows envious of the women who have pretty clothes and costly jewelry, and sets about trying to sell her young body to buy the luxuries of life. The end is inevitably a house of prostitution. Whatever increases the prevailing wage." What did the people who lived there, think, or frequented there, think? Not a lot of people were asking them that, unfortunately. But in one case, a resident of Maxwell Street, another area that people would often go slumming, did write a letter into the Daybook, a newspaper in 1915, saying, quote, "Slumming in Chicago today is not what it was years ago, I am sure. The people of yesterday who went as a matter of interest and curiosity to visit the ghettos in this city have entirely vanished and are replaced by persons of lesser respect for mankind. It is a strive on the residents' part to earn an honest livelihood, and they are often made targets for ignorant sight-seekers who pass them by in their colossal automobiles merely to ridicule them and theirs." Which is most of what it comes down to. Even our religious protesters, part of being there is to prove how high above it you all are. This also, though, led to this wonderful cartoon appearing in the newspaper, to small people entering to probably normal-sized people entering a massive gilded door, and below it says, "Please don't disturb yourselves, my good people. My friend and I are only studying conditions among the rich." So again, the rich would just go into people's homes to see what was there, under the guise of saving them. But as our resident of Maxwell Street inferred, things changed, and what would maybe started as, we're going to learn and to save, turned more just as into an excuse to be voyeuristic and to take part in all of these things. As William T. Stead said to a gathering of Women's Christian Temperance Union members, he said, quote, "I simply state a truism that those who argue that I was mistaken in assuming that some of the mere fashionable society ladies were present at the philanthropic meet-in must be regularly aware of the habits of the creator of the creature of slumming or philanthropy is the fashion she is now always foremost in the swim. She's only there for anything, to get anything for a new sensation, anything for a fresh thrill to break the ennui of a blasé existence." Yeah? So even amongst those the religious, you have the hardcores, which then leads us to our final, debauchery. The main thing that was drawing people to the various levees of the city. Think of it, especially with that first levee at Van Buren and Dearborn. You're staying at the Palmer House, the auditorium, this beautiful modern hotel with a delicious, amazing restaurant. And a few blocks away, everything else. The entire other side of the world. Yeah. Or even when it moved down to 22nd Street, you just take the streetcar to a whole different life. And we talked about the department store girl. There was this sort of idea, too, of in the daytime, you're going shopping in these department stores, going to these restaurants, being waited on, or helped by these young girls, and seeing a show with these actors. And maybe later that night, you can find them out at these bars. Wilson, writing about Vice, wrote, quote, "The visitors to these houses are men of means. No one without a full pocket can afford such indulgences. These houses are largely attended by strangers visiting Chicago. Those thinking themselves unknown in a large city care little for privacy and boldly show themselves in the general parlors. You will find among them lawyers, physicians, judges of the courts, members of Congress, and even ministers of the gospel from all parts of the country. Men who at home are models of propriety seem to lose all sense of restraint when they come to Chicago. They meet abandoned women here and accompany them to their houses, risking disease, robbery, even death, with a recklessness that is appalling. Young men of respectable families come here nightly and spend hours in company with these abandoned women who frequent the places. These same young men would shrink with fastidious horror at even moments' conversation with the cooks and housemaids of their own homes. Yet here they find pleasure in the association with women equally as ignorant and unrefined in every way, and unworthy to compare with the honest and virtuous maids of their homes. Chicago was a place where you could come and be someone entirely different. Show up, be completely unknown, and engage in the things that someone who has no record can do. I once did a cross-country trip, and I just gave myself a mustache as the thing, whereas nobody's going to see me again. Who are these men, these wealthy men? Well, Mr. Harland imagines one walking from his hotel, the auditorium, to one of these other hotels in the levee and saying, "Hello, I am Mr. Edwards from Cincinnati. I'm a businessman, and the evening is boring. Mr. Blank, the hotel clerk, tells me you can find me a companion." Howard Vinn, in the guide Chicago by Day and Night in 1912, wrote that this is understandable because there is no mortal man in this universe of ours, be he ever so homely or ill-favored, who does not cherish in his heart of hearts the impression that there is a woman or two somewhere whom he could charm if he wishes to. Suppose, Vinn writes, for instance, that Mr. John Smith, who's a merchant in comfortable circumstances at home and quite a great man in his town, is taking a stroll down State Street in the bright afternoon sunshine. He's just gotten outside of a good dinner at his hotel, prior to which he had a good shave and a cocktail. Just the combination to make a well-to-do traveler with a little time on his hands feel literally out of sight, as the slang phrase goes. Suppose then, as John passes Marshall Fields, he observes a magnificent creature, a royal blonde, mayhap, or a plump brunette. Either will do for the sake of illustration. Peeping shyly at him from beneath long silken lashes and smiling ever so slightly. Now, John may be a deacon in the church at home. He may even be the father of a large family. But if he is human and animated by the latent vanity that is the paramount trait of his sex, he will instantly experience a sensation of pleasure and attribute the strange beauty's attention to his own long-dormant power to fascinate. It is inevitable. Any man comes to Chicago, and he could be lured away at any second. Yes, by abandoned women, actors. The money'd come to Chicago to show off, and there were a lot of them coming to Chicago, but even in Chicago. As Wilson wrote, quote, "They are the third largest class, that which may be said to give Chicago's fashionable society its peculiar tone, consisting of the newly rich. These are so numerous and make themselves so conspicuous that they are naturally regarded as the representative class of Chicago society. They may be known by their coarse appearance and still coarser manners, their loud style and ostentatious display of wealth." Now, you all read the Sipes. Oh, thank you so much. This is why you give a talk. You read the Sykes, the Skies and Street Guide and the Standard Guide, so you know not to dress ostentatiously. But if you're new money, you're not doing that. You're showing it off, such as perhaps Mr. Edmund Gatlin of Kansas City did in 1911. I know. Mr. Gatlin was visiting Chicago. He was staying at the Congress. And he met a woman there, Mrs. Hardin. Quote, "It was a reckless party which gathered in the Pompeian room of the Congress Hotel last Thursday night. Mrs. Hardin proposed the trip into the red light district. They would just hire a touring car and make a grand review of the South Side with stops at the all-night drinking halls and the ever-open resorts. Just a tour. A small tour, of course. Well, then they added a Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Gatlin asking for a little company, asking if Miss Hardin knew anyone. She called up someone she had met previously at the auditorium. She called her Miss Stroud. Her real name was Miss Ramadka. Gatlin, later on, quote, Gatlin is said to have $200 when he started. He found a pleasant welcome in the dance halls and drinking places. Soon, these became too dull for the party, which was becoming gayer with every pop of the cork, and the automobile turned into the region of shrill laughter and eclectic pianos. Their little tour went on and on and on, so much so that Mr. Motka said, "I have a headache," and sent Mr. Sweeney into a pharmacy at 22nd and Wabash, and then they abandoned him there. Miss Hardin, her companion, Mr. Sweeney gone, she went home too. So what happened next? Well, to quote the paper, Gatlin does not know. About 5:30 a.m. on Friday morning, police found him unconscious and prostrate at the corner of 28th and Michigan Avenue. The policeman, finding nothing of value on him, concluded he was the usual morning byproduct of the crime district. Again, speaking to how often this sort of thing perhaps happened. Eventually, he got home and discovered that a ring and a diamond shirt stud worth $800 were missing. But it's important to note, in these warnings of going to the levee, it was not the residents of the levee who robbed him. It was his companion from the hotel. Now, finally, in this debauchery grew something else, grew a new kind of fun, a new kind of culture that we still more readily engage in today. And that's as Chicago in the late 19-teens and early 1920s became not so much just the East meets the West of the cattle, but the North meets the South of the Great Migration, and of course, jazz. Music history minor in college. Chicago became this place where jazz really took off after New Orleans, because in New Orleans they had their own levee, Storyville, this place where ragtime piano players and stride piano players created jazz playing in brothels and in rent parties. But Storyville got cleaned up, and so they went up the river into Davenport, Iowa, of all places, but also into Chicago. And they started playing at these clubs in the levee. And the original Dixieland Jazz Band, it was originally Jazz with 2 S's, is the first group to record a jazz song onto a record. And Chicago, according to Alston Smith, we have to thank for the term jazz. According to Smith, quote, in 1914, the first white ragtime band, Tom Brown and his Dusters, played for 2 weeks at Lamb's Cafe in the Loop. And it was there at the corner of Clark and Randolph that jazz was named. The Lambs was having a little union trouble, and some of the striking help tried to hurt business by depreciating the band. Its music, they averred, was nothing but jazz. The word jazz was a colloquialism of the 22nd Street brothels. But it took off. And this new music that happened in other clubs, but especially happened in these in the brothels, in these dance clubs, became jazz that then spread to New York and to Los Angeles. And we get people like Louis Armstrong coming in to play with King Oliver and the Creole Jazz Band, and all these people coming to see jazz. And especially as the 20s pushed on. That was the beginning, Alston writes. The panic was on. Prohibition was coming in, and thirsty whites suddenly discovered that passable booze and superior music were both on tap in the Black Belt. 35th Street between State and Calumet began to jump. Along with it, the dimly lit sawdust-floored, gin-soaked little joints that were to make jazz history. That is the vice fighters' view of what these clubs were like. But you can just imagine the music spilling out a little bit onto the street and people gathering around curious, coming from Peoria to be tempted. And again, like with the stockyards, like with the moral ruin, it was the scale of it all, the immensity of it. As Chicago and jazz great Eddie Condon wrote about going to these clubs in the 1920s, quote, as the door opened, the trumpets, King and Lewis, one or both, soared above everything else. The whole joint was rocking. Tables, chairs, walls, people moved with the rhythm. It was dark, smoky, gin-smelling. People in the balcony leaned over and their drinks spilled on the customers below. Oliver and Lewis would roll on, piling up choruses, with the rhythm section building the beat until the whole thing got inside your head and blew your brains out. Everything and everybody moving, sliding, tapping out the rhythm, inhaling the smoke, swallowing the gin. Sounds fun. Yeah? Was it dangerous, like all these places, all these guides warned about? Skies and streets warned that you should avoid black people when you go down to the levee because they are, quote, apt to exhibit a supreme contempt for low white trash and demonstrate their distaste in a rather forcible method. The reality was no. As The Whip, a Bronzeville paper, wrote in their column, their nosy column, quote, some fine people who were doing what they're pleased to call slumming came near having heart failure when they were in a cabaret last Saturday night. A waiter saw fit to hit a patron over the head with a near beer bottle for some remark he made. Due to the lack of exits, the refined society people had to witness the fight in all its disgusting aspects. Nosy saw that they feared there would be in a pinch, and they were busy thinking up names to give so that their identity would not be known. When the disturbance was over, the slummers slinked out, and they will think again when they want to see the sights, and the doctors who escort these visiting ladies will inform them they are not going to a pink tea when they go slumming. You're going to see stuff, but just be cool about it, yeah? And also, as slumming became popular, as jazz became popular, this idea of touring the Black Belt, you got people like Mary Dalton from Native Son, who want to go there like the peoples of religious fervor. As Bigger Thomas was hired to be her driver, she picked up her communist boyfriend and said, let's go, show me the Black Belt, show me where you live, where you eat. Quote, you know, Bigger, she said, I've long wanted to go into these houses, she said, pointing out to the tall, dark apartment buildings looming either side of them, and just see how your people live. I've been to England, France, and Mexico, but I don't know how people live 10 blocks from me. As happens when they go, they eat chicken, they drink, and everyone mostly ignores them and causes them no trouble. And it was not another world. Writer Justin Smith of the Daily News wrote that in reality you go down to the Black Belt looking for danger, looking for this world outside, a place like Mexico or France. But in reality you find people who are proudly Chicagoans. Quote, from one point of view it is a threatening region, suggesting hoodlums, black and tan cabarets, holdups. From another, the district is the home of hardworking people on the move, laughing at their sorrows, thankful for the trees, the lawns, the comforts that the departing white people left for them. So why is it that Chicago became this place for all this meeting of the good, the best, the bad, and specifically a place where people wanted to see all those things at once? Well, Carter Harris in 1944 wrote that Chicago and the West are not far from frontier times. And that really was true then and especially earlier. Today, maybe less so. Samuel Painter Wilson, who wrote about Chicago's vice in 1910, wrote, if it is the wickedest city, it is also one of the best on the continent. It contains thousands of the worst men and women in our land, but it also contains thousands of the brightest and best. Bourget wrote, on the condition of having your nerves wrung once and for all, these are among the places you shall best see how American ingenuity solves the problems of a prodigiously complicated organization. An organization like a slaughterhouse, a brothel, or a jazz club. People came to Chicago to see everything on a huge and terrifying scale, to see creation, destruction, exploitation, ruin, sweat, booze, and hope. It was mythic, it must be experienced, and Chicago wanted you to experience it. Thank you.